Why does bread rise? The invisible science inside every loaf. A lump of bread dough can almost double in size without anyone adding a single extra ingredient. Set it on a counter, leave it alone for an hour, and somehow it becomes lighter, bigger, almost alive. But where does all that extra space come from? Flour doesn't magically multiply, water doesn't expand that much, and the dough hasn't been pumped full of air. So what is quietly transforming this heavy mixture into a loaf filled with thousands of tiny pockets of emptiness? The answer begins with something so small that millions of them could fit on your fingertip. For thousands of years, people baked bread long before they knew what microbes were. Ancient bakers simply noticed that if they waited, dough changed. It swelled, softened, and baked into something light instead of dense. They had discovered fermentation without realizing that invisible living organisms were doing the work. Many people still imagine bread rises because of the heat of the oven. It sounds reasonable. After all, the loaf gets much bigger while it's baking. But that explanation misses something important. Watch a bowl of dough sitting at room temperature and you'll see it slowly puff up long before it ever reaches the oven. Others believe kneading traps enough air to make bread fluffy. Kneading does introduce a little air, but nowhere near enough to explain why a loaf becomes mostly empty space inside. Flour isn't expanding either. Something else is happening, and it's alive. Hidden inside the dough are billions of tiny yeast cells. Baker's yeast is actually a living fungus called Saccharomyces cerevisiae. Each individual cell is microscopic, completely invisible on its own. Yet together, they perform one of the oldest biological tricks humans have ever used. But yeast has a problem. Like every living thing, it needs food. At first glance, dough doesn't seem very appetizing. It's mostly flour and water. Where does the yeast find anything to eat? The secret is hidden inside the flour itself. Flour is packed with starch, long chains of sugar molecules locked together like beads on an endless necklace. Yeast can't easily consume these giant chains directly. Fortunately, flour naturally contains enzymes, tiny biological tools that act like molecular scissors. As soon as water is mixed into the flour, these enzymes begin snipping the long starch chains into much smaller sugars. Now the yeast finally has a meal. As the yeast consumes these sugars, it carries out a process called fermentation. Instead of simply disappearing, the sugars are transformed into two important products, carbon dioxide gas and ethanol. The ethanol mostly evaporates during baking. The carbon dioxide changes everything. Imagine billions of microscopic balloons inflating throughout the dough at the same time. Every yeast cell releases tiny bubbles of carbon dioxide, and those bubbles begin pushing outward in all directions. But here's another mystery. If the dough is full of gas, why doesn't it simply leak away? The answer lies in something many people misunderstand: gluten. Gluten doesn't make bread rise, it makes it possible. When water is mixed with wheat flour, two groups of proteins begin linking together. One gives stretch, the other provides strength. Together, they form gluten, a flexible network woven throughout the dough. Think of it like an enormous web made of elastic rubber bands. Every time kneading stretches and folds the dough, that web becomes stronger and more organized. The carbon dioxide bubbles produced by the yeast become trapped inside this stretchy network. Without gluten, the gas would simply escape. It's like trying to inflate a balloon with holes in it. You can produce all the gas you want, but nothing stays inside.
With gluten, however, every tiny bubble is captured. As more carbon dioxide is produced, those bubbles slowly grow larger. The elastic gluten stretches instead of tearing, allowing the dough to expand while still holding everything together. That's why bread dough can nearly double in size without falling apart. And here's the surprising part. Most of a finished loaf is actually not bread at all. Much of its volume is empty space, thousands upon thousands of tiny gas pockets that were inflated by microscopic fungi long before the loaf entered the oven. Then comes the most dramatic moment of the entire process. Just when it seems the dough has finished growing, the oven gives it one final burst of life. Bakers call this oven spring. As the temperature climbs, several things happen almost simultaneously. The carbon dioxide already trapped inside the dough expands. Water begins turning into steam, creating even more pressure inside each bubble. For a short time, the yeast also continues fermenting before the heat becomes too intense. It's a race against time. The bubbles are expanding faster than ever, while the dough is still soft enough to stretch. Then suddenly, everything changes. The yeast dies as the temperature rises too high for life. The gluten network begins to firm up. The starches absorb water and harden into a solid structure. The loaf is no longer flexible. The bubble walls become permanent. The airy architecture that was once soft dough is now locked into place, preserving every tiny pocket created during fermentation. That's why fresh bread has its familiar sponge-like texture instead of collapsing into a flat pancake the moment it leaves the oven. This also explains why not every type of bread behaves the same way. Wheat flour is especially good at making tall, airy loaves because it forms a strong gluten network. Rye contains different proteins, producing denser breads with a tighter texture. Gluten-free breads often need other ingredients to imitate gluten's ability to trap gas, because without that elastic network, keeping bubbles alive becomes much harder. Gas production is only half the story. Gas retention is just as important. Even flavor depends on patience. The longer dough ferments, the more than just carbon dioxide is created. Yeast and other natural microorganisms produce a wide variety of flavorful compounds that give bread its rich aroma and complex taste. That's why slow-fermented breads often have deeper flavor than loaves rushed through the process. Not every loaf rises because of yeast either. Quick breads, like many muffins or soda bread, use baking powder or soda biscuit instead. These ingredients release carbon dioxide through chemical reactions rather than living organisms. Some pastries rely mostly on steam for their dramatic expansion. Different methods, the same goal: create gas, trap it, and lock the structure in place before it escapes. Modern commercial bakeries have become masters of controlling this invisible world. Temperature, humidity, mixing time, fermentation length, and even the amount of water are carefully adjusted because tiny changes at the microscopic level can completely transform the finished loaf. Scientists are still studying exactly how individual gas bubbles grow, merge, and stabilize inside dough. The interactions between proteins, enzymes, water, and fermentation are surprisingly complex. Even after thousands of years of baking, bread continues to reveal new scientific questions. That's what makes it so remarkable. Before baking, a loaf of dough is a living ecosystem. Billions of microscopic organisms are feeding. Enzymes are quietly reshaping molecules. Proteins are stretching into invisible scaffolding. And tiny bubbles are building the structure of tomorrow's bread. By the time you slice into a finished loaf, all of that life has ended. The yeast is gone. The fermentation has stopped. but the evidence remains frozen inside every airy pocket and every soft crumb. What looks like an ordinary slice of bread is really a sculpture shaped by biology, chemistry, and physics working together so perfectly that it feels almost effortless.